So next, we have Allie Detrio of Reimagine Power. So Allie is the chief strategist for Reimagine Power, where she is focused on microgrids and sustainable energy policy on the West Coast. Reimagine Power's clients include clean energy developers, clean tech startups, and sustainability-focused nonprofits, including the Microgrid Resources Coalition, where Allie serves as senior advisor for the West Coast. Prior to Reimagine Power, Allie was the manager of policy and strategy at ENGIE, the largest IPP and provider of energy services in the world, and where Allie cut her teeth on microgrid policy. In 2018, she was awarded the California Solar and Storage Association's annual award for her leadership in passing legislation to commercialize the microgrid market in California, SB 1339. And legislation extending the state's energy storage incentive program, authorizing $800 million in new funding, SB 700. Hello, Allie. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Sean. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with you all on this Friday, and I definitely could use a glass of wine here in the near future as well. So thanks again for joining and sticking with us here this afternoon. As Sean said, I'm Allie Detrio. I'm the Chief Strategist for Reimagine Power, and I'm going to talk to you today about microgrids and resiliency policy in California and what's ahead for 2021. Sean, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, we can hear you perfectly. We can see you. There's a little bit cut off at the bottom, like run under the words Reimagine Power Inc. I can't see the next row of letters, but I'm not sure if there's an easy fix for that. Just might be the way Zoom's working.
Okay, thanks. Good to know. Okay, so before I get started, I'll just quickly go through a little context setting for the microgrid policy history in California. So back in the early 2010s, the California Energy Commission issued grants for microgrids with their EPIC program. And so a number of different microgrids were funded through the California Energy Commission. And in response to seeing the great success that microgrids had in California with their deployment and research and development in California, Senator Stern, who represents the Malibu and Southern California region, introduced in 2018 a bill called SB 1339, which directed the CPUC to commercialize microgrids, and I'll get into that in a little bit of detail. That bill was successful and it was passed in September 2018. That date is important to remember because that happened before the Camp Fire. We had the wine country fires in Napa and Sonoma at 2017, but at that time, resiliency still wasn't a really big conversation in California when it comes to energy. But then in November of 2018, we had the Camp Fire and wildfires ravaged Northern California, causing PG&E to declare bankruptcy in 2019. Through 2019, we started seeing that public safety power shutoffs were initiated a little bit around the state and really got bad in October of 2019 when there was a lot of power shutoffs, especially with PG&Es in Northern California. Around the same time was when the CPUC opened a microgrid proceeding to implement SB 1339. And we've continued forward through in 2020 with new microgrid legislation being introduced last year, although it did not move forward, as well as the CEC deciding to include microgrids in their integrated energy policy report. So I'll go into all of this in more detail, but I kind of wanted to give everyone the setting for where we're at today, which is 2021, and we are in the process of developing microgrid regulations in California. And so, like I said, SB 1339 was passed and signed into law in September of 2018. Now, this bill directed the CPUC to facilitate the commercialization of microgrids by removing their barriers to development and creating separate rates and tariffs for microgrids. Now, this was being done to create a market signal to help with monetizing the benefits of microgrids. And so, at the time, the goal was to create something that was a separate rate signal from net metering, which has its share of challenges with solar, with the discussions about potentially being overvalued with generation and cost shifting politics. So the idea with this tariff was to create something that was new and distinct from net metering. And at that time, the PG&E bankruptcy had not yet occurred. So the bill was passed and signed into law. I was actually lobbying for the bill and in the Capitol on the very last day, where it was passed at 11:30 p.m. on before the deadline. So that was a really exciting time for me to be working on microgrid policy. And so over the course of time, we've had a year go by, public safety power shutoffs happened, some more wildfires, the PG&E bankruptcy, and then finally a year later, the CPUC opens the rulemaking to implement SB 1339. And so as all of this was happening, the CPUC amended the topic to include resiliency strategies to address the issues of public safety power shutoffs as well as commercializing microgrids. And so the CPUC broke the proceeding into 3 tracks, with track 1 being focused on short-term resiliency solutions that could be implemented before the 2020 fire season, more medium-term actions that could be done to commercialize microgrids, and then the longer-term issues related to microgrid policy development, such as things like developing microgrids that encompass more than one customer or potentially crossing rights of way. With track 1, the IOUs and the CPUC staff submitted proposals in January, and what the proposals that were eventually adopted was a PG&E temporary generation program that approved diesel generation being sited at substations. There was an approval of PG&E's Community Microgrid Enablement Program, approved for 2 years, although that has since been delayed and is now going to be integrated into track 2 of the proceeding, which I'll get to in a minute. A local area distribution controller was approved for SDG&E. There were interconnection streamlining proposals that were adopted, including the increasing of staff and the creation of specific resiliency teams within the IOUs that were dedicated to developing resiliency projects for local governments. There was modifications of existing NEM tariffs for resiliency, including removing limits on energy storage sizing and when storage systems could charge and discharge from the grid in advance of public safety power shutoffs. There was a creation, I think this is a big one, creation of a local government data portal for grid infrastructure. I heard in the last presentation, you know, access to data is a really important element of project development, no matter what energy projects you're undertaking, whether it be building decarbonization or microgrids. And so I think creating this local government data portal is really going to help with commercializing the development of microgrids. And then finally, the creation of resiliency project guides for local governments by the IOUs. And really that's going to help with local governments that may not have all of the technical expertise to navigate things like interconnection. These kinds of guides will really help with the development process. And so that was what happened in track 1. And notably, this proceeding went at what is considered lightning speed for the CPUC. To have a proposal issued in January and then a final decision approved in June is pretty impressive. There was a lot of disappointment, however, about the use of so much diesel generation at substations. And so that is something that, you know, the CPUC has been working to address, as well as the CEC with things that were adopted in track 2 and more information that I'll give you in a second. So track 2, the staff proposal for track 2 issues right afterwards was issued in July of 2020. And this had 5 main proposals and went through a series of public comments with over 50 parties, I think, really weighed in to the microgrid proceeding up at this point. And so the main proposals that came out of the track 2 decision were revising Electric Rule 2 to allow for microgrids to be classified as special facilities, providing limited exemptions from what's known as Electric Rule 18 and 19 to allow for some public agencies to transmit power between adjacent facilities during outages only. There was the creation of a microgrid tariff for Rule 21 NEM eligible technologies to further streamline interconnection. The creation of a $200 million ratepayer funded microgrid incentive program, a pilot program for methods of low-cost electrical isolation, and the authorization to continue using diesel generations at substations for public safety power shutoffs, so long as a clean generation pilot is also pursued. So all of these proposals are really striving to accelerate the commercialization of microgrids. And the track 2 final decision was voted on recently, just last week on January 14th. So these were the proposals that were adopted. And so one thing I'm really excited about is seeing that this exemption from Rule 1819 for public agency microgrids transmitting power between facilities, while I think that it's really hard to make a project pencil when you're only allowing it to transmit power between facilities during an outage, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to expand on this proposal in the future by allowing microgrids to serve adjacent facilities and optimize the energy resources between those facilities in blue sky conditions, not just black sky conditions. So that's one thing I'm really excited to see about in the future. And Commissioner Rechtschaffen stated as much in the voting meeting that he'd like to see that expanded as well. So that was something we were really excited about. So the next thing that will be on tap for this proceeding is this ratepayer funded microgrid incentive program is going to go through a series of stakeholder workshops to really define the criteria for what types of communities should get the funds for these projects. And so that's something that we look forward to working on in the first half of this year. Other activity in this rulemaking included a diesel alternatives workshop and ruling, where the CPUC hosted an all-day workshop to basically find out what other technologies are off the shelf and ready to be deployed that can replace diesel generation at substations. And so that was the genesis of issuing an interim approach to make sure that we're keeping the lights on, while also looking with an eye towards the future at a transition to clean temporary generation in 2022 and beyond. Hence the reason for the approval of that Track 2 proposal that included clean generation pilots. Finally, the formation of the CPUC Microgrids and Resiliency Working Group, where meetings are going to be held approximately once a month, addressing some of the deeper technical and regulatory issues with microgrids. So they have already had a couple of these meetings that got hosted at the end of last year, and they are probably going to be kicking off in February of this year. Against the backdrop of all of this happening with Track 2, I just wanted to call out, as many of you may have seen, that we had a lot of blackouts earlier this year, also from rotating outages called because of a heat wave in the summer. So against the backdrop of all of this commercialization efforts for microgrids, we have continued to have blackouts, and I think that one of the big opportunities for microgrids in the future is not only serving as resiliency solutions for customers, but they can and should play a prominent role in addressing grid reliability. One example I'll give is of the Miramar microgrid that was down in San Diego, and that microgrid was actually able to shed a lot of its load and provide a sort of demand response to the grid when it was in need of extra capacity. So that was an example of how microgrids can support grid reliability in times of grid stress. So the root cause analysis, the final report was just released. The main reason that this was, there's a lot of confluencing factors that led to the CAISO blackouts. And so the CPUC did issue a new order on 2021 reliability. And so they're seeking new solutions for flexible generation, demand reduction, but also, unfortunately, it looks like we're probably going to have an expansion of some gas-fired resources. So again, I really think that microgrids can and should play a prominent role in grid reliability. And again, just to reiterate, public safety power shutoffs have continued across California. This picture is one of PG&E's PSPS event from October 2020, where we really are seeing that the need for microgrids is significant and widespread across California. Southern California Edison was just recently sent a letter by President Batcher at the commission asking to report, I believe it's next week, and explain their use of public safety power shutoffs and if they were really necessary in the face of wildfire risk, because they had been used so many times in November and December over the holidays. So a lot of those communities in Southern California also subject to PSPS events. And so we really need technologies like microgrids that can serve as resiliency solutions. And there's many different ways that we can deploy these technologies with minimal capital outlay and this will increasingly become attractive to customers that are impacted by outages. So we're coming up now to track 3 of the microgrids and resiliency proceeding. So in track 2 with the staff concept paper, along with the initial 5 proposals that I outlined before, staff introduced a concept paper that was a really well-researched thought piece outlining some of the longer term issues with microgrids that will need to be addressed in track 3 and beyond of the proceeding. So some of the big ones that need to be still addressed, and I believe the CPUC will be addressing these in either the working group and in the track 3 proceedings specifically, are value of resiliency. How do we quantify resiliency? What does it mean to be resilient versus reliable? You know, what are the different tiers of resiliency that may need to be valued differently? You know, who should be prioritized with resiliency solutions, et cetera. Issues with departing load and standby charges. These are very onerous charges that are often assessed on microgrids, and the legitimacy and, you know, breadth of these charges needs to be re-examined and potentially modified so that we can have microgrids become more economical in California. There's also challenges with developing microgrids that cross rights of way or serve multiple customers that aren't under common ownership. So staff in the microgrid concept paper outlined some potential pathways for developing multi-customer microgrids. This has received a lot of attention of late, and some of you probably have heard of the Public Utilities Code 218, which prohibits microgrids from crossing rights of way unless they become a public utility. And so staff outlines a couple different potential pathways for how we could develop multi-customer microgrids without such onerous CPUC regulation, changing the law to exempt microgrids from public utility status, or modifying that section of code. They also outlined 2 other options, which is microgrids forming electric cooperatives or micro utilities. And so the Resiliency and Microgrids Working Group is going to cover a lot of these issues starting in February. So 2 of the main things that are going to be addressed in the first half of the year are standby charges and multi-customer microgrids. So looking forward to participating at the CPUC in those working group meetings, and encourage all of you who are interested in microgrids to be involved in the working group so you can share your input about how we make California more resilient. Moving on to the California Energy Commission, I reiterated this a little bit before, but the Integrated Energy Policy Report is issued every other year covering key energy policy topics and issues. And so this year, IPER is going to have a volume on microgrids to put forward policy recommendations on how they can be best used to both increase grid reliability while also accelerating our transition to a clean energy future. So that is going to be scheduled to release the first half of this year. I believe that volume 1 was just recently released, so I'm hopeful that volume 2 will be out here in Q1, maybe first half of Q2. Additionally, the EPIC program R&D focus area is going to also study the value of resilience. And so some of the activities that are going to be funded by the EPIC program will cover value of resiliency and how, again, we really quantify and assess the benefits of resilience for customers and, you know, use that information to make decisions about the grid and about the future energy system. Also yesterday, just give a shout out, the CEC hosted an Alternatives to Diesel workshop on January 21st, which was yesterday, covering a lot of issues with data centers and those being very large energy users that may not be able to just install only solar and batteries. And so talking about some of the other technologies like fuel cells, linear generators, combinations of resources like solar, battery, fuel cell, how do we get to a world where we don't utilize backup generation that is fossil-based like diesel. So I think that was a really good workshop yesterday. There's a lot of really great technologies and solutions presented, and the CEC is currently taking comments on that over the next couple weeks. And then finally, here we come to 2021 legislative session, which is underway. Right now, I think there's going to be several bills that are introduced on resiliency. I'm just going to flag two of them here for you today. SB 45, which has been introduced by Senator Portantino and several other senators, is the Wildfire Prevention, Safe Drinking Water, Drought Preparation, and Flood Protection Bond Act of 2022. This is authorizing the sale of $5.5 billion in funds for climate and resiliency investments. This was actually introduced in 2019 and again in 2020, but it did not move forward, unfortunately, last year. There's a lot of politics, and I think with the pandemic, there was just concern that trying to put a very large bond measure on the ballot in an election year was not going to sway the voters, and so it was eventually, the bond proposal had gotten up to $6.8 billion, I believe, and had a lot of really great things in there, but ultimately the pandemic really put a wrench in a lot of legislative proposals in 2020, this one included. So I was really excited to see that it's been reintroduced this year, and even more excited to see that $175 million was earmarked for grants that can fund microgrids, distributed generation, and energy storage for backup power and resilience. I do anticipate that there will be more things added to this bill as it goes through the legislative process, so it's very possible that this grows from 5.5 billion to a similar amount, like 6.8 was what it got up to last year, potentially even more. We'll see. I think the voters do understand that climate change is a very important issue, so maybe this is a better year to try to put a bond on the ballot. And one other one I'll flag is SB 99 by Senator Dodd, which is the Community Energy Resilience Act of 2021. This bill is looking to create a CEC grant program for local governments that will help fund the development of planning and resources for local energy resilience. One thing that we hear in the public sector a lot is that local governments just don't have the capacity to do the planning and development necessary to deploy resilient energy solutions. And so this is really looking to, streamline and develop a standardized set of resiliency investments and planning tools for local governments. So I'm really excited about that one. That was also introduced last year, but unfortunately the pandemic did thwart that one. And so Senator Dodd has reintroduced it this year as SB 99. So I'm really excited about it. And there's more legislative proposals on resiliency likely to be released. There were many that were introduced last year. And as right now we are just starting 2021, the bill introduction deadline for the 2021 legislative session is February 19th. So I expect to see a flurry of bills introduced in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for more, more bills to be introduced on resiliency. And so 2021, what are we looking at here? I think that climate resiliency policy will be one of many priorities for lawmakers in Sacramento. Now that we have a new, more supportive federal administration with President Biden coming in, I'm really excited to see, see our federal government provide support to the states for climate and resiliency initiatives. And so while I know the pandemic is still a major focus for most legislators, I do think that we'll see, a focus on climate and resiliency this year, as we've already seen with some of these bills be introduced. Microgrid commercialization is going to continue at the CPUC in 2021. I think that will be the main venue for microgrid policy in this coming year, but it's very possible we see, like with SB 45, more bills on microgrids. And this was brought up in the last presentation as well with renewable natural gas. Bioenergy, hydrogen, other clean fuels will be a focal point as new policies are developed to promote alternative, reliable fuels. I think we realize we need to move off of fossil fuels like diesel, and thermal energy resources will still be needed in our energy system. We cannot just have everything be all electric. There's a lot of commercial industrial applications where that just doesn't make economic sense. And so fuels like hydrogen and bioenergy, I think, will continue to grow and become more viable alternatives to fossil fuels. And so that's something that's going to be a focus area for our state. And then the main challenge we have is really balancing the trifecta of reliability, clean energy, and affordability. This is a challenge. We have to make sure that we are decarbonizing in a responsible manner while we're still making sure that this is an affordable place for people to live, and that we are not placing burdens on those that can least afford it. Equity is a big concern in California, especially now that we have gone through the pandemic. And so balancing these pillars is going to continue to be a challenge, but also an opportunity for California's clean tech sector. And then finally, microgrids, again, I think they're a triple bottom line solution for customer and community resiliency, grid reliability, and achieving all of our aggressive decarbonization goals. So I'm really excited about the future for microgrids. And with that, I'd love to take your questions.
Well done, Allie. Thank you. So I have a question around just on that last slide that you were presenting. If you don't mind bringing it back up.
Oh, absolutely.
It seems like one of the through lines in the conversation today was around biogas. And I just want to say that my team designed a microgrid for a local sovereign nation. It hasn't been implemented, so it's just all design, right? But it was a really interesting design question of like, how do we balance the huge amount of wind that's available in the evening at this site? It's on River Valley, and a huge amount of sunshine available during the day. Everything's cool. But there's like an hour or two in the evening and in the morning, when, but particularly in the evening, when the loads are huge. And so there's alternative, like, do we do wood batteries or do we do chemical batteries? You know, like, do we do stored, you know, energy in materials? So anyway, when you've looked at this question, how do you, give me a little flesh on the bones. What do you think about the use of biogases? Where are you going with that? How much? When?
I think a lot of it will determine on geographics and location. Bioenergy resources, so we're looking at, you know, there's different types of bioenergy resources as well. There's forest biomass, which I think is a great way to utilize the forest waste that we're going to have through all of our wildfire mitigation efforts that we have underway in California. CAL FIRE is projected to spend, I think, $1 billion in the next year on wildfire mitigation and doing forest fuel reductions. And, you know, we need to figure out a place to put some of that forest fuel that is laying around and potentially could cause wildfires. And so I think putting that to beneficial use in places like Humboldt County, for example, or the Eastern Sierras, where we have a really bad bark beetle problem, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for forest biomass in areas where it makes sense, so it's very localized energy solution. I think with things like renewable natural gas, when you're looking at potentially utilizing agricultural waste, that could be something that is a clean alternative to just doing burns in the Central Valley or flaring of regular methanes in landfills. So, and I do think that the urban waste challenge that we have, you know, we have a lot, bioenergy can really be used as a holistic energy solution when we're also thinking about our waste management challenges. Everyone produces waste, every municipality has a waste problem, and so having solutions like bioenergy resources that can put that waste to beneficial use, I think is a really big win-win. It's not just about the energy, but also, you know, thinking about the full supply chain and the full ecosystem in which these technologies are being developed. You know,
Well,
a waste management solution is helpful.
Open your mind, if I can press you to be a little bit more specific, if you can, on the question of like, well, is this intended to be used for that, you know, like 2 hours in between sun and wind in the evening? Is that the amount of time you're thinking that this fuel is getting burnt? Or
well, there's a lot of different kinds of ways to utilize bioenergy, including gasification and pyrolysis. So you know, combustion is not the only way to utilize these resources. Especially now that we're getting gasification, it can be injected into the pipeline. There was another bill that passed last year, AB 3163, that allows for gasified organic waste to now be injected into gas pipelines, which will help us with cleaning up our gas system. And that could be used at any time. So I think with bioenergy, the great thing about it is that it can be used as a flexible fuel resource. It can be used as a source of baseload for when wind and solar are not available, but it could be utilized at any time. And so I think it's really about finding that right mix of resources. I think diversity is the cornerstone of resiliency, as well as making sure that,
Well,
you know, we are.
I apologize just for two reasons. One is because, to be honest, this is a conference on all electric, and so I don't want to give too much time to the discussion of like a wide scale use of injection to the existing fuel system. So, but
Sure.
also because out of politeness, we're at exactly at time. So I just wanted to, in the most polite way, just say like, well, we should continue that conversation.